All right, we are going to do a follow-up tonight. This is kind of a continuation. We've been studying the matter of the Sabbath and the institution of the Sabbath, and in a like vein, there's the matter that pertains to the Ten Commandments, and we've talked on and off about this. In fact, the Ten Commandments study was one of the very first studies we did when we started our Q&A back in 2017. I think we studied faith only first, which led to a study of Calvinism, and then I was looking through the notebook that we were using at that time that everybody had, and it wasn't too far in. We were talking about the Ten Commandments, but this will be a little bit more in-depth study with regard to some of the arguments that are made with reference to the matter of the Ten Commandments. Now look, I know this audience, we all understand that we don't follow the Ten Commandments today. We know those things, we understand those things, we understand why. But there's a difference in knowing or perhaps understanding, and then at the same time having the ability to articulate to others why those things are so. To me, it's like it goes back to we talked about in our Sunday morning class about when we were studying the baptism of Jesus, and to ask the question, well, why was Jesus baptized? Well, of course, the pat answer that we all know is to fulfill all righteousness. It's Matthew 3:13-17. You know, when John didn't want to baptize Jesus. He said, I need to be baptized by you, and now here you are coming to me. And Jesus said, permit it to be so for now, for thus it behooves us to fulfill all righteousness. And so we know what the phrase is, but then the follow-up question is, well, what does that mean? In other words, can we articulate what it means when Jesus said to fulfill all righteousness? And the example I gave you was one of my cousin's best friends, his 3-year-old daughter. If you asked her, what was Einstein's theory, or what is Einstein's theory of relativity? And she's 3 years old, and she'd look you dead in the eye and say, E equals mc squared. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, that's Einstein's theory of relativity. E equals mc squared. All right? But now, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I figure about most of us have no idea what that means. And even if we knew what the E and the M and the C stood for, we'd probably still have a difficult time explaining how all that works. So the point is, to give an answer and then to be able to explain or articulate that answer are two completely different things. And so if we were to ask the average member of the church, why don't you follow the Ten Commandments? Then we might just immediately say, in other words, the default answer is because He took the Ten Commandments away at the cross. I mean, is that the first thing that comes to your mind? You know, if somebody says, why don't you follow the Ten Commandments? We would say, well, because Jesus nailed the Ten Commandments to the cross. All right, well, that's true. That's right. But do you know what that scripture is that says that? And can you articulate what that means? In other words, even if you can point to the passage, can you articulate that principle? And so I want us to spend a little time tonight talking about the Ten Commandments and dealing with some of the objections to the assertion, the contention, or the affirmation that we should not follow the Ten Commandments today. And I've got four things that I've heard, and things that have been said to me in the course of trying to explain to people why we do not follow the Ten Commandments. Now, we can take everything, essentially we can take just about everything we studied in our last two sections on the Sabbath and understand and make that argument. The Sabbath was only given to the Jews. The Sabbath was not given until the giving of the law. The Sabbath, was not given to any other people other than Israel. And so, with that in mind, then we say, all right, well, the Ten Commandments, a lot of that follows the same pattern. The Ten Commandments was only given to the Jews. The Ten Commandments was not given to anyone prior to the Jews in Exodus chapter 20. Again, the Ten Commandments weren't given to any other nation. And then when the law of Moses is done away with that would be the Ten Commandments. In other words, the Ten Commandments of necessity would have to be included in that, lack of a better term, that abolition or the nullification of the Ten Commandments. And so I want us to think about some things tonight relative to objections to the affirmation that we should not follow the Ten Commandments today. And I did some of these in the 1-minute videos on Instagram and Facebook Reels. And so, but I wanted to do a far more in-depth study with these things for tonight. And the one thing, it always kind of makes me chuckle when I hear this, when you talk to people, and when I say talk to people, it's either talking to people or corresponding through email or social media, whatever. Invariably, you're going to hear, when you say we should not follow the Ten Commandments today, people are going to say, oh, so you must think it's all right to commit murder and adultery, right? Because if you don't believe in the Ten Commandments, then you must believe it's all right to do everything that's forbidden in the Ten Commandments. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. And there are two ways to look at it, and I think this is the correct order in which to deal with them. The first is this: aside from the Sabbath, every commandment in the Ten Commandments is restated in some form, either expressly or in principle, in the New Covenant. I mean, for example, throw out a commandment. Give me one. Other than the Sabbath, give me one. I already gave you two of them. Honor your father and mother. Can we find that? Can we find that in the New Testament? Indeed we can. In Ephesians chapter 6. Verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it might be well with you and that you might live long on the earth. Ephesians 6, 1-3, right there in the middle of the New Testament. So we have the restatement of that. Also you have this, on the negative side, in the two really serious, well, there's not two, there's actually three. There's three really serious lists of sins in the New Testament. One's at the end of Romans chapter 1. One is in the works of the flesh in Galatians chapter 5. And the other is in 1 Peter chapter 3. Well, there's a list of sins that are not 1 Peter, 2 Timothy chapter 3. I'll get it right in a minute. 2 Timothy chapter 3. And in two of those three lists, disobedient to parents is in both of them. You listening? Okay, just make sure. Y'all three listening? Tevin, you listening? All right, just make sure. Disobedient to parents. Oh, Shorty, Jetman, y'all listening? Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to leave y'all out. Disobedient to parents is listed right alongside the worst sins that anybody can think of. It's indicative, as it says, of a reprobate mind. It's indicative of people who are lovers of selves more than lovers of God. And so disobedient to parents is found, again, we've already noted that the admonition to honor father and mother is in Ephesians 6. On the negative side, we see not doing that falls into a very grievous, or a list of grievous sins in Romans and in Timothy. And so, restated. What about murder? Do you think, is it all right? Well, what does the Bible say? Where does it say in the New Testament that we're not supposed to murder? Well, what did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 5? You've heard it said to those of old time, you shall not commit murder. And whoever murders be in danger of the judgment. But Jesus said, I say to you, whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment. So what did Jesus do? He took the actual act of murder and rolled that thing back all the way to the matter of the heart that leads to murder. You see? The New Testament takes the things, what about adultery? Well, we'll stay right there in Matthew chapter 5. You've heard that it said to those of old time, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whosoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery already with her in his heart. You see how the New Testament repeats these things and in many cases makes it far more strict. In other words, the old law, as a general rule, dealt with what a man did. But on the other hand, the New Testament not only deals with what a man does, it deals with what a man thinks. And so all the things, covetousness, you know, thou shalt not covet, right there in the Ten Commandments. Colossians 3, verses 5 to 7, Paul says, covetousness is idolatry. What did Jesus say? Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things which he possesses. Luke 12 and verse 15. And so it would be with with all of the commandments. We can find them somewhere restated in the New Testament expressly or in principle, and in almost every single case given more strictly than they were given in the old law. So there's the first argument, or the first response to the idea, oh, so you think you can commit murder and adultery, or lie, or whatever. And by the way, we can talk about lying, bearing false witness. Man, the scriptures on that in the New Testament are just, it's replete with matters of being truth tellers and not liars. But then the second is this. With the exception of the Sabbath, all of the other 9 commandments were sins before they were found in the 10 Commandments. Is that right? I mean, did it only become a sin to commit adultery after the 10 Commandments came into effect, or was it a sin to commit adultery before that? Was it only a sin to be a murderer after God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, or was it a sin to murder before? You know, because what sin did Cain commit? Murder. And what did he say? He said, my punishment is greater than I can bear. So even Cain understood what he had done was a sin. It was an affront to God. And then we get off the ark in Genesis chapter 9. And what does God say to Noah and his family and to all men living under patriarchy from then on? Whosoever sheds man's blood, by man's hands shall his blood be shed. Or by man, in other words, if you kill somebody, you're going to get killed. You murder somebody, you're going to be executed for that. So implicit in that is it's wrong to murder. It's always been wrong to murder. Murder didn't just become a sin problem after Moses got the 10 Commandments on the mountain. And so the first answer is all these things aside from the Sabbath are repeated expressly or in principle in the New Covenant. And again, the Sabbath accepted. All these things were sins. It was a sin to dishonor your parents before the 10 Commandments. It was a sin to lie before the 10 Commandments. It was a sin to covet, commit adultery, murder before the 10 Commandments. It was a sin to lie before the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments did not make these things sinful. They were sinful long before that. So that's the answer to the kind of the knee-jerk reaction. So do you think we can commit these sins now if the 10 Commandments are no longer in force? All right. Any questions or comments on that one? Philip, you monitoring? I saw you look down. I thought maybe somebody might have. Okay. All right. Just making sure, because usually this is the kind of thing where people will comment, because this is such a people have such a strong reaction to this teaching, and so I wanted to make sure we don't miss anybody. All right. Then, what's that? Nothing on the feet. All right. Secondly, people will say, Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Now, did Jesus say that? He did. Where did he say it? Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse number 17. Think not that I'm come. Now let me just make mention here. The word that Jesus used in this particular text can be rendered abolish, but it can also be rendered destroy. Now I really don't think that's a big point of contention with regard to this argument, but it could be, depending on the mindset of the person with whom you're talking. But Jesus said, I did not, think not that I came to destroy the law or abolish the law. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. All right? He said that. Now, one thing we have to understand here is, again, it goes back to the original question. What did Jesus mean when he said that? What did it mean when Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law? He said, I did not come to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And so the idea of fulfilling applies both to the law and to the prophets. He came to fulfill the law. He came to fulfill the prophets. All right? Now, with regard to the law, we could say that he came, for example, to fulfill Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 through 20, where Moses, speaking to the children of Israel, says, God says, I will raise up a prophet from among you, from among your brethren like unto you. He says, and I'll put my words in his mouth. He says, and whatever he commands or speaks in my name, I will require it of them. In other words, God's going to send another lawgiver. He's going to be like Moses, and everybody's going to be answerable. Everybody's going to be answerable to that prophet. Okay? Now, if you think back a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3, on Sunday, in our Sunday morning Bible class on John chapter 1, you remember they asked John 3 questions. Are you the Christ? Are you Elijah? Or are you the prophet? And what did we conclude? That even the Jews did not understand that the Christ and the prophet were one and the same. Jesus is the Christ, and Jesus is that prophet of Deuteronomy 18. So thus, when Jesus came, he fulfilled the law, for example, in that respect, in that he fulfilled God's promise to send a new lawgiver. All right. Also, he fulfilled the law in this sense, that he brought it to completion. He brought it to completion. To fulfill a promise means to what? Bring it to completion. And Jesus was the completion of the old law. In other words, he didn't come to abolish it, he didn't come to destroy it, but he did come to bring it to its fulfillment. Now, in that is built the idea that when it's fulfilled, it's going to be taken away, right? The Old Testament itself foretells of its own, and I hate to use the word demise, but you know what I mean when I say that. The Old Testament foretold of its own ending. And that ending would not come until Jesus came. Okay, so he came to fulfill the law in that sense. Obviously, we know how he came to fulfill the prophets. 300 prophecies about, more than 300 prophecies about Jesus, and he came to fulfill all of them. Most of the time, though, when we think about him fulfilling the law, we think about him fulfilling the law in the sense that he lived perfectly under the law. And that is true, but I don't think that's the main point he's trying to make here. In living perfectly under the law, he brought it to completion. In other words, one led to the other. In other words, the end game is he came to bring it to completion, and the only way for him to do that was to live perfectly under it. Think about it. All through the ministry of Jesus, people accused him of being a lawbreaker, right? And especially he was a Sabbath breaker, right? He healed somebody on the Sabbath. By the way, more than once. So they referred to him as a lawbreaker. He referred to himself as the Son of God. That makes him a lawbreaker. He referred to himself as being one who had power on earth to forgive sins. Matthew 9, verses 1 to 10. They thought that made him a blasphemer. Over and over again, they accused Jesus of coming and living against the law of Moses, when Jesus never did any such thing. He lived under the law of Moses. He repeatedly affirmed the law of Moses. What did he tell the lepers after he healed them? Go and show yourself to the priest and offer a sacrifice in keeping with the law of Moses. So Jesus lived under the law of Moses. Jesus affirmed the law of Moses. He compelled or commanded others to keep the law of Moses. So it was obvious that he was not there for the purpose of destroying the law of Moses. All right? And so we have to understand what it means to fulfill that thing, or what it means to fulfill a thing. And when Jesus said, I did not come to destroy but to fulfill, he meant I came to bring it to its conclusion. In other words, I came to tie up all the loose ends that are associated with the law and the prophets. Now, in so doing, he brought the law to a conclusion. He brought the law to a conclusion. In other words, it was what we might say, a law, what was called the law of double effect. In other words, you do a thing, and then there's a secondary effect to the thing that you are doing. And bringing that law to a conclusion was the secondary thing. Now, look at Romans chapter 10. Look at Romans chapter 10. And we're going to begin in verse number 1. Romans 10, beginning in verse 1. Now I want you to think about this statement, especially. Let's just start. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. And they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and having gone about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. Is that about the first 3 verses? Now let's get to verse 4. For Christ, you're reading ahead of me, aren't you? For Christ is the, give me that next word, end of the law to everyone who believes. That's pretty hard to miss, isn't it? Christ is the end of the law. End means he's the completion of it. He brought the whole thing to completion, and in so doing, he brought it to an end. Christ is the end of the law to all those who believe. I don't see how a person gets around that. I really don't. You know, you can say what Jesus said in Matthew 5:17, and you'd be right. But the application of that text is just so contrary to so many other clear teaching texts in the New Testament. It's not that we don't believe Matthew 5:17. It's that we believe what it actually means. We don't believe it means what they say it means. Because you cannot reconcile Matthew 5:7. You cannot reconcile that take on Matthew 5:17 with Romans 10 and verse 4. And so when 2 verses seem to be in contradiction, or when a verse seems to be in contradiction with an interpretation, then we need to check the interpretation, right? And so Christ is the end of the law to all those that believe. Right? Any questions or thoughts on that? Here's the third argument that I've heard. And the third one one that you would find if you were going to do some research on that subject. And this one I hear all the time. Where there is no law, there is no sin. Now, does the Bible say that? It does. Look in Romans 4:15. You should be in Romans 10. Turn back a page or two. Look at Romans 4:15. Because the law brings about wrath, for where there is no law, there is no transgression. Here's another passage. This is the one I hear more than Romans 4:15. Here's the one I hear most. And that's 1 John 3 and verse 4. Whosoever sins transgresses the law, for sin is a transgression of the law. Now here's the problem with the application of those two texts, but particularly the one in 1 John 3. Every time you see the word law, you cannot assume it's talking about the law of Moses. Now, if you've been in the Wednesday night class, what did I tell you about the phrase the law? What did I tell you about the law in the book of Romans? That in almost every case, when you see the word law in Romans, you probably need to think first law of Moses, unless the context demands otherwise. But that is not the case with the rest of the Bible. It can be the case in various texts. For example, in Ephesians, where Paul talks about the law in Ephesians, at times in chapter 2, he's talking about the law of Moses. But there are other times when Paul talks about the law, and he's not talking about the law of Moses. For example, brethren, if any man among you be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Well, that's obviously not the Ten Commandments or the law of Moses. And so we want to be careful about allowing people to take every reference to law and make it refer to the law of Moses. Because, again, there's a host of problems with that. First, if all of these references mean that without the law of Moses there's no transgression, then there's no such thing as sin prior to the law of Moses. Is that right? I mean, if the reference to the law, for example, in 1 John 3:4, that sin is a transgression of the law, then before the law there can be no sin. And obviously we know that is not right, because we know that men were offering blood sacrifices for their sins. Adam and Eve, what got them kicked out of the garden? Sin. And there wasn't anything remotely akin to the law of Moses in Genesis chapter 3. Adam could not covet his neighbor's wife. That's exactly right. Adam could not honor his father and mother. Right. Then that's the whole point. That's the whole point. To try to make the law mean the law of Moses in every case, as I sometimes say, that which proves too much proves nothing at all. And so the idea that where there is no sin, or where there is no law, there is no sin, making that apply to the Ten Commandments is problematic, because obviously the world was destroyed by a flood because of sin. And there was no Ten Commandments, no law of Moses prior to Exodus 20, and there certainly wasn't one in Genesis chapter 6. All right, any questions or thoughts on that? All right, one more. Now, here's kind of the tricky one. Some people will tell you, they'll admit the law of Moses was taken away at the cross, but not the Ten Commandments. In other words, the Ten Commandments were the exception to what was taken away at the cross. All right? Now, open your Bible. They think they have Bible for that. So let's look at it. Let's look at Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2. In verse number 13, and you being dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, contrary to us, and has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. You see the words there? The handwriting of requirements. Well, the Ten Commandments wasn't handwriting. But there's another like passage. Turn back to Ephesians chapter 2 and in verse 14. And we'll read verses 14 and 15. For he is our peace, who has made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinances. So what they're going to argue is, the Ten Commandments are the exception to this. There were 613 thou shalt and thou shalt nots in the Old Testament. And this line of argumentation says 603 of them were done away with, but the first 10 are forever. That's the argument. And this thing kind of hinges on this terminology here. The handwriting, the handwriting of ordinances or the law of commandments contained in ordinances. And they say all that was done away with was like the priesthood and the laws that governed everyday Judaism and worship patterns and all those types of things. Those were all done away with. That's what Jesus took out of the way at the cross, but the Ten Commandments are forever. That's a common argument, all right? So now, we need to answer that. And the easiest way to answer it, in my view, is Romans chapter 7. So open your Bibles to Romans chapter 7. Let's read the first 4 verses of chapter 7, okay? First 4 verses of Romans chapter 7. Or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law. Now what I say about the word law or the law in Romans? Law of Moses. And by the way Paul says this, it's obvious he's talking about the law of Moses. I'm talking to those who know the law. That the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she is released from the law of her husband. All right, so Paul sets forth a premise here. That when a man and woman are married, they're joined for how long? Joined for life. But if the husband is what? Dead, then what? She's released from the law of her husband. All right? Now verse 3. So then, if while her husband lives she marries another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. Now, let me just say one thing real quick. Don't get bogged down in all this with regard to what Jesus taught about marriage and divorce and remarriage in Matthew 19. Okay? Because Jesus obviously gave an exception, in Matthew 19:9. Matthew 19:9 is not God's law on marriage. It's God's exception to his law on marriage. His law on marriage is found in Matthew 19:4-6. Man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. They're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. That's God's law on marriage. Verse 9 is God's exception to the law on marriage. So let's not get bogged down in what Paul's saying here in Romans 7 and verse 3, as if, well, Paul must not have known what Jesus said in Matthew 19. That's not what Paul's talking about here. He's using a principle of marriage. That God's law for marriage is one man, one woman until death separates them. That's God's plan for marriage. And that's the foundation that Paul is building this entire argument on. All right? If her husband's dead, she's free from the law of her husband. If the husband's dead, she's not an adulteress if she be married to another man. Now verse 4. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you should be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. So, Paul likens the law of Moses to a dead husband. Is that right? You've become dead to the law. You're not dead, you're dead to the law. You're not dead, your husband is dead. Your first husband is dead. And who's the first husband here? Law of Moses. You're dead to the law that governed your relationship with your first husband, so that you can be married to another, even to him who is what? Raised from the dead. I think we know who that is, don't we? That ain't Lazarus. It's Jesus. And so Paul likens their relationship to the law with a woman's relationship with her husband. When the husband dies, she's free to be married to another. And so he says, your first husband, the law of Moses, is dead so that you can be married to Christ. If your first husband wasn't dead, you couldn't be married to Christ without being a spiritual adulteress. That's what he's saying. All right, so are we clear on that, on those points? That we're talking about the law of Moses, and the law of Moses is likened unto a husband that has died, freeing the wife to be married to another. All right, now, go down to verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would have not known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law said, you shall not covet. Did you notice Paul used the phrase the law 3 times in this verse? 3 times in this verse he used the phrase the law. What law is he talking about? Law of Moses. And he says that the law of Moses taught him, thou shalt not covet. The law taught him that. Now, of all 613 thou shalts and thou shalt nots that are in the law of Moses, where is thou shalt not covet found? What part? In the Big Ten. That's right, Kyle. In the Big Ten. Thou shalt not covet is only found in the 10 Commandments. It's not found anywhere else. So if Paul is talking about a law that is dead in verses 1 through 4, and that dead law contains the phrase, thou shalt not covet, then what has to be dead? 10 Commandments have to be dead. If he's talking about the law repeatedly in the first 4 verses, and he comes back and refers to that law 3 times and says, that law that is dead contains the phrase, thou shalt not covet, then whatever part of the old law that says thou shalt not covet is of necessity dead. And again, the only place you find thou shalt not covet is in the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were done away with, just like all the other 603 ordinances and worship laws and everyday living laws and penalties for laws. The 10 Commandments were done away right alongside. There is no way to do away with 603 and keep 10. Not according to Romans 7, verses 1 through 7. All right, any questions about that? All right, open your Bibles to the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We're going to keep on with this theme with regard to the 10 Commandments are somehow the exception to the rule. In verse number 7, actually, let's just start in let's start in verse 2 and set this thing up. Read through verse 6. You are our epistle, written in our hearts, known and read by all men. Clearly, you are an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God. Not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. And we have such trust through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as being from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient as ministers of the new covenant. The new covenant. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, sometimes people will take this passage in verse 6 and they use it to disregard the teaching in the New Testament. They say the letter kills, and the New Testament's written in letter, but the Spirit gives life. And what they do is they take that verse and apply it in such a way as whatever the Spirit puts in my heart, that's what God wants me to do. And don't be bringing me all this, because the letter kills, but what the Spirit puts in my heart, that's life. Now there's a problem with that. The first problem is the letter that Paul is talking about is the 10 Commandments, the tablets of stone. All right? And the second problem is, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I mean, to minimize the written word of God in favor of one's personal feelings or whatever yearnings or desires that they have, well, first of all, it's a recipe for anarchy. Because, if we're just going to be led about by our feelings, then everybody's feelings are their feelings, and one person's feelings are as good as another, and there's really no objective truth to be determined, because I cannot determine objective truth based on my feelings or your feelings, right? And so it's a misapplication. It's a misapplication of verse 6 to speak in terms of, well, the written part's not as important as the heart part. That's really the summation of that idea. But I mention that to say this. Paul introduces a thought here in verse 3 when he says, tablets of stone. Tablets of stone. Because we all know about these tablets of stone, don't we? And we know what was written on tablets of stone, don't we? We know what part of the old law was written on tablets of stone. Right? All right. Now, look at verse 7. Paul says, and by the way, this is how we know that the application of verse 6 is wrong. But if the ministry of death, written and engraved on stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance, which glory was passing away, how will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious? See, Paul's setting up a contrast between the tablets of stone, which are basically a synecdoche for all of the old law, and the ministry of the Spirit, which is a synecdoche for the gospel of Christ. The law of Moses kills. the gospel of Christ gives life. The ministry of death is written and engraved in stone. Now, again, what part of the law of Moses was written and engraved in stone? 10 Commandments. And Paul describes the 10 Commandments as the ministry of what? Death. I mean, do you want to try to be saved by something that is described as the ministry of death? I mean, do you want to put your eternal hope in something that Paul describes as the ministry of death? Look at verse 9. For if the ministry of condemnation had glory, the ministry of righteousness exceeds much more in glory. So Paul has now referred to the 10 Commandments as the ministry of death and the ministry of condemnation. Now look at verse 11. For if what was passing away was glorious, what remains is much more glorious. Again, he describes the 10 Commandments: ministry of death, ministry of condemnation, and that which is passing away. So, well, Todd, how can the 10 Commandments be spoken of as passing away? And the best explanation I have is what we would refer to sometimes as the grandfather clause. In other words, Jesus took the old law away when it was nailed to the cross. But that doesn't mean that every Jew everywhere on the planet was immediately lost from the time that the church was established going forward. In other words, there had to be we'll just call it this because I think it's inaccurate. And we use this terminology in our day and time, and I think it's accurate, particularly in this, a grace period. A grace period. So what's a grace period? A grace period is a period of time that allows you to what? Get up to speed or catch up to what's going on. Well, there was about a 30-year grace period after the establishment of the church. And during that 30 years, the gospel was being preached to the whole world. And as the gospel made its way into the world, everywhere the gospel was preached, the law of Moses was done away with at that time. At that time. When the gospel was preached, the law was done away at that time. And the law of patriarchy was done away at that time. And then once the gospel was preached to the whole world, and the Bible says that it was, Colossians 1:6, Colossians 1:23, Romans 10:16. Once the gospel was preached to the whole world, nobody could be saved by the law of Moses, and nobody could be saved by the law of patriarchy. So there's that what we call a 30-year grace period. That's why Paul refers to it as passing away. It was declining in its authority, its scope, and its influence. Now, very quickly turn to Hebrews 6 because the Hebrews writer uses this same terminology. Now did I say Hebrews 6? I meant Hebrews 8. We'll start in verse 6. Hebrews 8. Hebrews 8. We're going to look at 7 things from verse 6 to the end of the chapter with regard to the new covenant. Number 1, verse 6. It's a better covenant established upon better promises. By the way, how many wills or testaments can a man have at one time? Just one, is that right? Scott, is there an exception to that? My resident counsel, I wanted to make sure I didn't speak out of turn. A man can only have one will and testament at any given time. All right, so which one's the one that counts, Scott? The last one, the newest one. All right, so we're contrasting covenants here in Hebrews chapter 8. There's an old covenant and a new covenant. And the new covenant is a better covenant established upon better promises, verse 6. What do we find out? What do we learn about the first covenant from verse 7? What was wrong with it? It was faulty. If the first covenant had been faultless, then no need would have been sought for the second. So in other words, it had problems. It had problems. I'll give you a quick example of this. My folks went to Scott's office and had a will made up 10, 15 years ago, maybe longer. Well, not too much longer. They moved here in 06 or in 06. But they had a will drawn up, all right? And in that will was provisions for the house that I live in now. When the will was made, they owned the house. They lived in the house. Now, at some point in time in 2016, Rhonda and I bought that house. Now, I don't know if it would have created any difficulty, if something were to happen and then that house was, part of the probate or the estate. But just to make sure there was no confusion, Mom and Freeman went back and wrote another will and took the house out of it because they didn't own the house anymore and they didn't want there to be any confusion. So, even though there's a contingency in the first will concerning the house, that will's done. And by the way, some other pretty significant changes were made to that will. All right? But the only one that counts now is the second one that they made. In other words, at some point, the first one became faulty. So it had to be replaced with the second. The old law of Moses was faulty and it had to be replaced with the second. Then verse 8, it's called, I'll make a new covenant. A new covenant. Okay, that's contrasted with the old covenant. Then look at verse number 9. The new covenant is contrasted with the old, and the old was the one that was given in the time frame of being led out of the land of Egypt. Well, what covenant did God make when they came out of the land of Egypt? 10 Commandments and the law of Moses. And the new covenant is contrasted to that covenant. It's not an extension of that covenant. It's a new covenant. It's not old covenant 2.0. It's not the old covenant, not the new and improved, old covenant. It's a new covenant. All right. Then look at verse 10. The new covenant will be written in their hearts. And Paul already made that distinction in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 3 through 6. Verse 12, the new covenant is contrasted with the old covenant in its ability to remove and remit sins. The old covenant could never do that. It's not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to forgive sin, Hebrews 10 and verse 4. Then lastly, here's the phraseology I mentioned. In that he says a new covenant, he has made the first what? Obsolete. No power in it. When he spoke about a new covenant, he made the old or the first one obsolete. And now what is becoming obsolete is now growing old and ready to vanish away. And so what we're seeing is what we're seeing here is the end of the grace period, so to speak. And so Hebrews 8, verses 6 through 13, Colossians 2 Corinthians 3, verses 7 through 18, but particularly verses 7, 9, and 11 are just, they're just unget-aroundable in the idea that the 10 Commandments are still around, and obviously Romans 7, 1 through 4 and verse 7. So, obviously, like I said, I think we all understand we don't follow the 10 Commandments today, but we need to have in our mind some of the potential objections that would be offered to that in those discussions. All right, any questions or thoughts? All right, if not, I've gone a little bit over time. I'm going to shut this thing down here. I'll tell you what, if everybody be on your